This is Patrice. Hello, everybody. This is Patrice Onwuka. I am the director of the Center for Economic Opportunity at Independent Women's Forum. Happy Hump Day. The CEO, we are the home for all of the tech, labor, and economic policy at IWF. And I would love for you to sign up for our newsletter. It's called The Pointer because we get to the point. And so that's including all of our analysis, our news, and any of the other updates on some of the policy that we're putting out at IWF and at our CEO. If you want to sign up, go to iwf.org/CEO. Very simple. So today's topic, work. Not surprisingly, right? We have over 11 million unopened positions, a near record high. That's a lot of open jobs, but we also have millions of people who are sitting on the sidelines of the labor force. Now, the question is, how do we get them back to work? Well, one of the areas or one of the ways to do that is to knock down those barriers that keep people, those able bodied, available people from working. Surprisingly, one of those ways is the government. One of those barriers is erected by government. Excessive occupational licensure is one of them, where government requires certain things to be able to work in a particular occupation or job. It can be fees, education, training. And sadly, often these requirements are out of sync with the actual needs of the job. They can be arbitrary. They can be set so high that newcomers are just not able to get into those occupations. And it's sad because these are very often good paying jobs that can lead to careers and even entrepreneurship. Now, increasingly in the United States, we're seeing more of these requirements, more of these licensures than ever before. And there's really little or no health or public safety rationale. Frankly, there's a more sinister motive that's rigging the system to keep out new competition. I mean, did you know you have to have a license in some states to arrange flowers, give out health and diet advice, even teach yoga? It's unbelievable, but it's true. And the Institute for Justice has done some fantastic work looking at all of the licenses for different occupations across the country. They've scored lots of wins for women, like Donna Harris, a Mississippi occupational therapist. She was also a personal trainer, and she's an aspiring nutritional educator who the state tried to shut her down from giving out diet advice. Literally giving out diet advice to people because she wasn't licensed. But she won her case. The state was not going to lock her up and fine her with $1,000 worth of fines because she relented. And we actually profiled and talked to Donna as part of our Chasing Work series. You can go to our website and find Chasing Work for all of the profiles of men and women who were hampered by occupational licensing. Now, this is one win. Donna's example is just one win, but we need systemic change. And there's great news that there's reform efforts across the country in many states to tackle these licenses. We've written a little bit about it. We have a policy focus on that on our website. But I've called in the experts today. These are women who have been studying occupational licensing and can tell us about some of the changes, some of the reforms that they're excited to see taking place. So I'm going to welcome them to the stage. Joining me today are Alana Wilson, Associate Director of the CSOR. We will have her, the full title of her organization running across the bottom. Dr. Darwin Dawo, who's a senior research fellow at the Institute for Justice, who I'm named, and an assistant professor of economics at San Jose State University, and Senator Shoshana Weissman, who's also a fellow at the R Street Institute. So ladies, welcome to today's show.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think Senator Weissman will be joining us shortly. There she is. Shoshana, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to call in the experts because, you guys know so much about occupational licensure, and wanted to really get our audience to think about how can we get the millions of people who are still sitting on the sidelines of our economy and our labor force back into the jobs, into work. And unfortunately, it's not even a matter of them, being incentivized to stay at home. It's not a matter of them, having other obligations that keep them out. It is actually government barriers that are keeping many people out of the workforce. So we're going to talk about that today. We'll start with a nice round robin question. I talked a little bit about occupational licensing and I kind of framed it, but I'd love to hear from each of you. Do you think as a nation we are moving in the right direction when it comes to occupational licensure? Is it getting worse or getting better in your view? Alana, we'll start with you, then we'll go to Shoshana, and then Dr. Darwin. We'll round up this discussion.
Sure. I think it's a good question. And for very quickly, CSOR is the Center for the Study of Occupational Regulation, in case anyone was wondering. But I do think that we're going in a good direction. And I'll just point to a study done by Dr. Edward Timmons back in 2013 that he did with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where he only cited that in the last 40 years, there were only 8 occupations that were delicensed. When that was updated from 2015 to 2020, we saw that there were about 35 cases of delicensing. One of the good things I always like to say, because one of my main jobs are to talk to different legislators about occupational licensing and common sense reform within their states, is to say that the nice thing about occupational licensing now is that it is a bipartisan and a nonpartisan issue. The Obama administration had a white paper come out about it. Then the Trump administration had a white paper come out about it, and the Biden administration had mentioned it. So it is something that, at least on that level, there's something that they could all agree on. It's that there is an overreach of government when it comes to occupational licensing, specifically in some different licensures. And we can get into that a little bit more later. So I'll just touch on that by saying that and pass it over to Shoshana.
Yeah, I think it's gotten a lot better. It's going to take time, and there's a lot that has to be done. The job is not anywhere near done, but we've made a lot of progress. And having the Obama administration endorse it was a huge move. Biden too. I mean, like on the campaign trail, he was talking about hair braiding licensing reform, which was exciting to have that, like him think of that as a campaign issue, not just any campaign issue, but a left of center campaign issue. So that was great. It's still definitely more championed by Republicans, but there is a lot of interest from Democrats. It doesn't mean that there's no interest, just maybe a bit less. What states left and right have been leaders. You see it more on the right, and I'd love to see it more from the left. I'm happy for whoever does it. I'm here to nerd with whoever. But especially with universal licensing recognition from Governor Ducey being the first in the nation to do that in 2019, I think after that, you really saw a ton of interest. Like, whoa, this is an easy way where we don't even have to knock out licenses, but we just let people work across state lines. And I think that also softened it, so people realize that licensing reform isn't even always about getting rid of a license, but maybe changing what the license looks like, changing the barrier, or sometimes getting rid of it or letting people work across state lines, but that there's a lot more than just like get rid of it. So I think it's going in the right direction, but we always need more work.
I'd like to agree with my co-panelists. I think there's room for optimism here. I also would say there's like a grain of salt is we have over 800 occupations licensed in at least one state in this country. So it's a huge mountain of licensing that we're dealing with. So I take heart from reforms like universal licensing recognition, like reforms where people with criminal records or even arrest records can actually apply for and get a license again, where you can have military spouses being able to have their licenses from another state recognized in new states. But the overall broad landscape is that there's still mostly licensing is static, right? Like we see like very small number of these licenses being removed, as in Dr. Timmons' article, and also thinking about the magnitude of the requirements, right? So we can see about the cases where people can move between states, but they still have to have a license to work in many cases. Mm-hmm. And that becomes a big challenge if you don't have a license from another state to even enter the occupation in the new state. So I'm optimistic, but with a grain of salt.
Okay, well, that's good. I mean, I think I would join you all in agreement, probably maybe a little bit more optimistic just because it seems like a bipartisan issue. And interestingly, I stumbled across an article that you would have think was written by one of us here. From we represent educational, but also some right of center organizations, and this was coming from a very progressive leftist magazine periodical talking about Black women specifically, and how, occupational licenses are keeping them out of work, and, using a lot of the very same arguments that you guys mentioned just now. So I think there is recognition. Certainly the powers that be are probably not very pleased about the idea of the left and right coming together, because then they can't peel each side off to play against one another. But we'll get to those tactics a little bit later. Darwin, I'm going to stick with you on this next one. So let's dive a little bit deeper into kind of those reforms, and Shoshana touched on it just a little bit. But different states can approach reforms differently. Maybe wholesale reforms of particular occupations, or scaling back the requirements within one. And you recently wrote about universal recognition. So can you explain a little bit more what that concept is, how it works, and then, what reforms do you think work best?
Absolutely. So this is a policy brief that we did with the NE Center for the Study of Occupational Regulation. It documents universal licensing recognition reforms through April of 2022. So to give a little backgrounder on this is when you already have a license in one state, and you either move or want to work in another state, and you are allowed to have your license recognized. So instead of having to go through what we describe as a relicensure process, where you have to complete all those education and experience requirements again, sit through more exams again, pay more fees, meet all these other requirements that the state may have, they'll recognize the license that you already have, which recognizes that your credentials and your experience move with you. So as of April 2022, we have 18 states, which is not quite half the country, but we're getting there, that actually have some form of universal licensing recognition. And so this is a pretty cool reform where we can think about how universal licensing recognition isn't just selected to people in certain occupations, because we've seen that before. For example, in California, my home state, there's like provisions for barbers and cosmetologists in a reform last year to have licenses recognized from out of state, but it doesn't apply to all occupations. Or does it apply to all individuals, right? So is this just for military spouses, or does it apply to anyone who moves or wants to work? And so the cool thing about universal licensing recognition is it basically says all are welcome. If you have a license, or in 4 states, if you have experience, even from a state that doesn't have a license, you can then have your work recognized and get a credential as a licensed worker in the new state, which is pretty cool. So we're now able to recognize that people's work experience also moves with them. And if you've been working in this occupation for 3 or more years, like, why is somebody coming in and saying, well, that's not enough because we want you to also, pay all these hundreds of dollars of fees, right? Or if we want you to pass all these exams when you've been successfully working in these occupations. So that's a pretty cool reform that I think is great room for optimism. And I'll say the majority of these don't even require you to have a residency status before you can apply. So 5 of the states do, but that's not even a third, just barely, but not even a third of these states that have it, which is pretty cool. So that means you don't have to, usually 6 months to a year, have residency before you can apply for the license. So you can get right back to work, which is especially important for people who are moving with their partners. And they may not have a choice in where they move, but they can still get back to work.
That's great. What are your other thoughts on universal recognition?
So I think it's a useful starting point. It starts from the point where all of these occupations are still already licensed, right? Mm-hmm. So we might want to question if you need to be licensed, or if there are alternative methods that might work better, starting with market competition. But it does basically break down barriers to all of these labor markets in these states, which is great room for optimism, improves mobility for workers. We're seeing a lot of evidence of that, improves outcomes for women. So especially when women are following like their male partners to new states, right? They can get back to work. The family doesn't lose income if they rely on that income. So that's a lot of room for optimism. And the other nice thing about universal licensing recognition is it basically retains the state's authority over their own licensing requirements. So they're not basically trying to get into a compact, for example, with another state and losing some of their ability to sort of legislate and do reforms internally, because it's all universal licensing recognition.
Well, Alana and Shoshana, you guys were nodding, but especially on the compact idea, what are your thoughts about compacts versus universal recognition?
So I tend to prefer universal recognition, but compacts have their uses too, especially if you're working constantly across state lines. Also, just making sure everything is recognized. Like I recently had, I have all these diseases, and sometimes I need weird medication. And I was just working to figure out how to get medication to me in DC. Turns out I had to ship it to a friend just over the border in Virginia and get it here. So it's a silly issue. It shouldn't work like that. And here, that's different. It's pharmacy licensing, but you don't want to have to go through that. You want to minimize that because I was lucky I lived near a border and had a friend right there. But otherwise, maybe I had to like pay some random guy on the internet to do it or rent a PO box, and that's not ideal. So just making sure that like it can work as easily as possible, that it's as smooth as possible, especially for people who have reason to work across state lines. Medical professions, things are big that way. And making sure that compacts aren't like, oh, you can go through the process to get recognized, but oh, you move here, you're good. Like basically something like that. Maybe max you register or something. So it has its uses there, but it also sometimes has the downside of basically codifying the harshest regulation, whether or not it's the best regulation, because that's always a bit of a concern, making sure that we're not doing that. Because even compacts, compacts for basically any kind of license have their uses, but you want to make sure that it's not codifying the florist license or the hair braiding license, or even just excess training that's going to make it so all these states then raise their requirements that have nothing to do with health, safety, or even consumer welfare in practice or in theory. So you have to worry about that. I like compacts, but I prefer recognition and smoother processes. But especially in the medical field, I'm a little more sympathetic.
Anything to add on that, Alana? And if not, it would be, we kind of started talking a little bit more about those alternatives to, well, we really haven't. It would be good to even start talking about alternatives to licensure. Like, is a license the end all be all to ensure that someone who is trained or capable or is going to provide a good level of care, whatever service, whatever that occupation is?
I would just like to echo Shoshana here on how I feel about compacts versus universal licensing. In the medical field, it does get a bit stickier, but when I talk to legislators and they say to me, well, what about this compact? What do you think about it? And usually it starts with something in the medical field, which seems relatively reasonable, but then you think about the florists in Louisiana, which then the surrounding or contiguous states to Louisiana might say, oh, wait, why don't we have florists also licensed? And then it goes into this whole, snowballed into onerous regulation. And although you're part of a compact, you've now added on all of these extra regulations onto your state, and you're now deterring people from going after that occupation or that career field. So just wanted to add that little thing on there. And as far as alternatives go, I'm going to just defer to Institute for Justice's inverted pyramid. So those of you who haven't heard of it, it's an inverted pyramid. So what they do, basically, they have voluntary and non-regulatory options first. So just stuff like market competition, quality service self-disclosure, voluntary third-party professional certification and maintenance, and voluntary bonding and insurance. Then after that, when we get into the more nitty-gritty occupations that are, I'm going to just echo Shoshana in saying that healthcare occupation is when government interventions would come in place. But there's still a lot of other options out there than going all the way to licensure. And again, that's the inverted pyramid, because you're kind of funneling the, entry into the position the more you go down this pyramid. So you have private causes of action, you have inspections that you can have, registration, state certification, and then licensure being your very last option when it comes to regulating a field. And I say this because, one, I love this inverted pyramid. I think it's very visual. I think it's something easy to remember and kind of easy to comprehend. But the other thing about it is once you start that, you have that license, it is, as I've already cited earlier on, it is very difficult to then de-license that occupation when you take a step back and you're like, hey, we haven't had any complaints of customer service going wrong, or any complaints about any ill will towards any sort of consumer that might be interacting with these professionals, and maybe we should look at delicensing it. Well, that process, as we can see, doesn't happen often. So going through these other options first, and then maybe looking at licensure as the last option would be something that I would recommend doing.
Others' thoughts on those alternatives?
I'll just chime in at IJ. We do really like to share that inverted pyramid. It's, I think, a great visual. If you're looking for it, it is in License to Work. So you can find that at the IJ website. I don't have the link right now, but it's, you just put in License to Work IJ and you'll find it. And so it's a great visual. And we have, like, we can think about voluntary ways of ensuring consumer safety. One challenge that we see is that a lot of licenses get perpetuated without any evidence that there's substantial or substantiated harm to consumers. So we get these vague claims about threats to the public health and safety, but there's no evidence for it. And so one cool report we just had come out earlier this year is the Too Many Licenses report. So this is both a cool report and a cool data set for those of you who are interested in finding out about your state or an occupation that you're interested in. So it looks at these Sunrise Review commissions and the recommendations they made. So if you've heard of like Sunset or Sunrise, there's an important difference between them. So Sunrise reviews occur before a license is created, and Sunset commissions take place basically reviewing whether the license should still be in place. And so, of course, we can see how it would be much easier to keep a license in place with Sunset reviews versus Sunrise. But when you look at the Sunrise reviews in this report, there are over 500 reviews, and 80% of them did not recommend licensing. So that should, and it's across states, across occupations, and I think it goes back to like the late 1980s, if memory serves. So this is not like a random flash in the pan phenomenon. This is showing that basically when commissions actually review this and check it out, they usually don't find any evidence supporting the need for licensing. So that's pretty cool. And there are lots of other alternatives, right? We can think about voluntary or even mandatory bonding or insurance, right? If you're worried about that. If you're worried about fraud, we have laws for that. We don't need licensing. If you're worried about, like, for example, with massage therapists, if there's harm to consumers, you could think about inspections or registration and background checks, which are recurring, which we use for things like food safety, as opposed to a license, which is usually just upfront and intermittent. So we can think about all these alternatives, starting with market competition and voluntary certification, and only thinking of licensing as a last resort when there's substantiated and substantial harm that cannot be reformed in any other way.
Well, I think what you guys are hitting on is there honestly, there tend to be two different types of licenses. And I'm being very broad and categorizing occupations that way, but they're probably the ones that most people think of licensing. They're thinking of the doctors, the nurses, those in health professions, even, massage therapists, people whose bodies are we place in their hands. And then you have all of the others that people don't even think about. The HVAC technician who's fixing your AC, Darwin, and in California where it's super hot. Or the hair braider, or, the florist. These, probably don't pass across people's minds very often. And so, I think very often when we talk about licensure, everyone says, oh, no, we don't want the doctors to be unlicensed. I mean, I would think we would all agree. I don't want to go to an unlicensed doctor, but I don't care if my florist is licensed. So I think you're right. I think it's really important that we recognize that, yeah, they're kind of two different categories, but even in the medical profession, and Shoshana, I think you might be able to shed some light on this. There's still opportunities for reforming. We may not we don't have to get rid of licensure in the medical field, but there are ways of easing some of the challenges that our medical professionals have, particularly as we saw during the pandemic. So what did we see happen as a result of the pandemic in the medical field?
Yeah, the pandemic was a very fruitful time for occupational licensing reform in a way I didn't expect. As soon as it started, I'm like, oh crap, I'm gonna have nothing to do for like a couple of months. And then like all the doctor, like there were all these waivers, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I guess licensing reform. So it was kind of cool to be that person who could like help and say, hey, consider this. And there was stuff that I genuinely didn't think I would see in my entire lifetime happening, like letting immigrant doctors work here. Usually not as doctors, usually it was other medical professionals, but still, like they did it safely. There's so much opportunity for reform. Like I want my doctor license, especially because there's evidence of harm where doctors aren't licensed. Like you don't have an underground hair braider or florist causing harm. If that happened, I'd be like, okay, that's data. Like let's consider it. But there's tons of cases of unlicensed doctors and even licensed doctors causing harm, but higher rates for unlicensed doctors. Like you don't have the friendly neighborhood underground unlicensed doctor. That's a different thing. But making sure they can work across state lines, making sure that doctors from France can work here easily, doctors from any place can. Maybe there are certain countries that maybe their standards genuinely aren't up to ours and we would want them to have more training. I have no issue with that, but making sure they can transfer into the system somewhere, saying that you're not starting from zero, but okay, you could pass these tests, you could go here, maybe you need 1 more year of training, maybe 5, but to having fully trained doctors who are up to our standards go through the entire process again is just asinine. But at least 3 or 4 states allowed foreign medical school graduates to work here during the pandemic, which was really great. And now there's bills being introduced around the country to allow that. Retired nurses were able to work because even highly trained professionals, like they can't just get relicensed like that. They often have to go through more training or more, inspection and certificates and stuff rather than saying, hey, if you want to work, you can work again. Lots of people were able to work across state lines. You just saw everything. Like really, states were opening it up really broadly, which is great temporarily, but you need permanence because people, of course, wanted to help out during the pandemic, but there's different incentives outside of pandemic times where it's not like they weren't doing it for a business reason for the most part. They were doing it to help. But if you're doing it for a business reason, you want regulatory certainty. So you want that stuff codified. Maybe not all of it. Maybe there's some stuff where we're like, this is too far. But the fact that foreign medical school graduates were able to work, maybe we transfer them in at a different level. Maybe they're physician's assistants, depending on where they're coming from, their level of training, their years of experience. But we should take that into account. But yeah, I never thought I would see that in my lifetime. And that was really cool. A lot of cross-state stuff too, because during the pandemic, there were hot spots of like COVID everywhere right here. So, maybe Nebraska was doing okay. So nurses and doctors from there would go to another state and be like, okay, you're having the problems. We'll come here and work. And thank goodness for that. But we still have a nurse shortage, a doctor shortage. It was way worse during the pandemic when so many people were in the hospital severely sick with COVID. But we have these shortages already, and we should be encouraging people to enter these professions, whether they're immigrants, whether they just want to do it for the first time. And I'm not always for tiered licensing because sometimes it's a good idea, like having doctors and nurses and PAs, but other times it just creates more regulatory burden and we don't want that. But in the medical sphere, it often tends to work pretty well, making sure you can at least do some level of care, expanding their scope of practice. Even the American Medical Association, which has lobbied against it, was like, oh, we can do this during the pandemic, but don't make it permanent. And I'm like, okay, well, at least we can do it during the pandemic. So there's a ton of opportunity there. And it worked. Like there wasn't extra harm caused. It wasn't like, oh man, the nurses that could serve people a little better, they did poor. Like there's no data of that. We want to make sure they have the flexibility. Sometimes flexibility can overcome other hurdles, whether it's regulatory or just shortages. Allowing people to be able to help out more just helps a lot. And yeah, it's stuff I never thought I would see in my lifetime. And I remember just thinking like, oh my gosh, it's happening. Like it's happening everywhere. And it's also kind of wild that the first universal licensing recognition bill was the year before COVID happened. It was literally months before. And following suit, all the other states were like, we need this. So that provisions to expedite for any kind of profession. You see this kind of thing happen a lot with people in construction and plumbers and stuff like that in places with natural disasters, but really doing that broadly.
Others, jump in if you'd like.
I was going to say, I'd like to piggyback off of that, just saying that I just came back from a conference yesterday, NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislators, and they specifically honed in on occupational licensing on this specific conference. And just going off of the changes ever since COVID, I know some states are even allowing pharmacists to give prescriptive authority to the pharmacists so that they can practice at the top of their level of education, training, and their licensure. So then that gives a bunch of room for other people to do other things. So I mean, it's in the healthcare field, there's that there too. Then I saw, like specifically, I'm from Pennsylvania, that we had some provisions put into place, some waivers put into place for both barbers and cosmetologists, and it was more focused on their education and where they could take their continuing education credits at, and a lot of them had to be in person. So when the pandemic happened, they switched it to online, and now that is law because they saw that, hey, I mean, with TikTok, with YouTube, I mean, we can learn how to do different hairstyles. So imagine an actual trained cosmetology teacher teaching those things. Like we have masterclass that anyone can take, right? So imagine having a professional actually teach you, and they thought to themselves, we can do this, and they don't have to meet in person. So then that way these people can still continue to work, and they don't have to take time out of their work schedules to brush up on their CEs or their continuing education credits. So there's been change across the board when it comes to COVID regulations that I've recently learned and I'm very happy about, but I do think that we can always do more.
And I just add on to the theme of shortages, right? We were thinking about like shortages at the start of this call. We can think about the nurse shortages, right? We have basically people who are fatigued from being in the third year of this pandemic, right? And people are burning out. So making it easier for people to like have their licenses recognized from other states, expediting licensing, recognizing these other kinds of licenses is very important for that. But another big occupation that's been affected in this way is teachers. From pre-K to K to 12. This is another occupation which skews female. Right. So we can think about women who like will be following like their partner to another state. It's not just women, but when we think about like occupations that skew women, right, we can think about this. And I have a friend whose partner is basically she can't become a teacher now in the state that they're moving to because he got a job in a very tight labor market in this state, and they won't recognize her license, even though she has years of experience. And this is the kind of stuff that keeps women from working and participating in the labor force. But it also creates shortages. Teachers are burning out. I mean, we're seeing a lot of schools being impacted after, again, all of these years of pandemic and teachers trying to figure out what to do with like online classes and transitioning back and COVID compliance and all of this. We need to make it easier for people to get back into the classroom and get to work. And Florida actually has just passed 3 bills related to licensing for military families, including making it easier for people who have their experience in the military to have their education training recognized so that they can get into the classroom faster. So that's pretty cool. That's a room for optimism.
And just a quick addition, I pulled up these numbers and I didn't want to get them wrong, so you'll see me looking down here a second, just to really show everyone the seriousness of the labor shortage that we have, and particularly, like Dr. Darwin said, that in particular labor forces that require women to really fulfill. By 2025, there may be a gap between 200,000 and 450,000 nurses. Like, that is a big deal. That's a big deal. Then by 2026, the U.S. faces a projected shortage of more than 3.2 million lower wage healthcare workers, such as medical assistants, home health aides, and nursing assistants. This is a big deal, especially with our aging population. This is a big deal. So I just wanted to put those numbers out there. So when we say there's labor shortages, and maybe in your hometown, you're not really seeing that, you're seeing this big influx, countrywide, it's very major. We're going into the millions here, and it's an occupation that everyone's gonna need at one point or another in their lives. So just wanted to put those numbers out there.
Oh, I appreciate those, Alana. I appreciate everything you all brought to the table, because it has been tremendous to watch all the different ways that we've seen states reform, and I do really hope that they start to make these permanent. You know, it's funny. I can think of family and friends who I've met who fit into so many categories. I had lunch, for example, with my husband. He's from Nigeria. I'm from the Caribbean, but both immigrants. But he has a friend who is a practicing doctor in Nigeria, years of experience, just moved to this country maybe 4 or 5 years ago. None of his credits. He was a practicing doctor, meaning he had gone through post-secondary education in Nigeria and was practicing and had to literally start from college level just to get back into the medical field. He now just finished up his residency, so he's for him, he's saying, was it really worth it to give up my entire life to really start from scratch here? And so I think that the pandemic has demonstrated that our medical establishment Maybe it's a matter of competition, but they absolutely should be thinking about how do we recognize the shortages you guys have laid out, and the fact that we have willing people from across the world who are more than capable, and you can find ways to ensure their certification and qualifications without forcing them to start from scratch. But it's so funny. We've talked about so many different categories of people who are licensed, who are impacted in a positive way by these reforms. I mean, we've been talking about military spouses who have over a 30% unemployment rate for these specific reasons. You're licensed and it doesn't transfer, and they're moving every 2 to 3 years. So what a great way to get a stable of new workers into employment whenever they move. Immigrants, and I think someone touched on it, people with criminal backgrounds. I think I'd love for someone to take that on. I don't think I had that actually in my notes, but that's a huge sector of the population who are incapable of working in places where they even had previous experience, or maybe they gained some skills in a particular trade while serving time, but they get out and their state does not allow them to obtain a license. Does anyone want to comment on people with criminal records?
I'm very excited to talk about this issue because I think, one, it's an extremely important issue, given, one, how many Americans are policed and go through the criminal justice system in the first place, and how that disproportionately affects different communities in America. And the other reason is because we're finally seeing some reforms on this, which is, that's an area for optimism for me. So you might be thinking, well, we don't want people, for example, like a firebug who was convicted of arson, being a firefighter. Okay. But should they be barred from all licensed occupations when a quarter of the United States labor force needs a license to do their job, according to the CPS? This is extreme, right? So we call these blanket bans. And this is where we have people who basically cannot do work in any of these occupations, no matter how long ago the crime was, no matter the rehabilitation, even if they've actually gone through the training required for the licensed occupation. So they find out after the fact that they're not allowed to get a license, which is just a waste. It's a complete waste of their resources and time and skill. So Pennsylvania actually had all these barriers on blanket bans. And IJ had a client who basically completed all of her cosmetology training and then was told, nah, you can't work, which is, and just, it's not exactly the kind of society that I think we could, that's where we want to be. We want to do something more that's inclusive and that lets people, once they've paid, their dues, that they can re-enter society and be part of the workforce. And when you think about how many Americans have had contact with the criminal justice system, this becomes such a rampant issue when we think both about the labor shortages and just unemployment in general, right? People actually need to have a way to re-enter society and have a sustainable system for that. So we see a lot of literature on this in the economics literature. And just making it easier for people to participate in the labor force is a huge step. And I would say it's also like good for us, like to, be inclusive in that way. So I think it's both an area for reform. Louisiana and Oklahoma actually just passed reforms on this. California, despite the fact that we have firefighters in prison who help put out our wildfires each year, still has very limited reforms on this point. So it's still very frustrating to see that. But we can think about this as a major area for reform. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll jump into, and so a lot of these laws, not all of them, but a lot of them are good moral character laws, and that's not a term with a legal definition. It's just like, do we vibe? And I don't think due process should rely on like, are we vibing? Like, do you vibe with this license? Like, that's not how due process ought to work. So that's one problem, and there's so many, like, I mean, when people are reintegrating into society, the more, like, basically if they have a job, they're less likely to recidivate. And if they have a better paying job, they're even less likely. So you want to encourage that. It encourages them to become productive members of society. It really helps along in the whole process. So when you tell them, oh, you can't do like any of this and for no reason, or there's no real connection, even some stuff that might broadly make sense doesn't always when you get into the weeds. Like there was a case years ago in Tennessee where a woman wasn't able to become a radiologist because she was a prostitute 10 years ago. It was 10 years ago. Nothing had happened since. She just wanted to, get back on her feet, but it was a sex crime. And she found that out, I think, through a friend, like independently. She was like going to pay a bunch of money to go to college to do this stuff. And it's like, oh, great, you're paying for all the school and wasted time while you're in prison too. It's what Darwin was touching on. Basically, you're often trained for things you can't do when you get out. And like, one, we should reform the laws, and two, prisons should not train people for things they can't do when they get out. Like that's just wasting their hope and time, and like that's not a smart thing to do. And even for the firefighters, like I know she mentioned the limited reforms. Part of it too is that it's a really competitive field, so like they're not likely to be able to do it. So maybe we should be training them to do things that they have hope of being able to do, and making sure those connections are tight, that like, like she said, you might not want an arsonist working as a firefighter, and maybe there's certain other small tie-ins there. But short of that, it's like we have to make sure that there's a real tight reason and a connection, because in the pursuit of supposedly helping public safety, we're hurting it by increasing recidivism. So yeah, we want to make sure of that. And also, if we don't believe in second chances, then why are we letting people out of prison? So our society is supposed to be set up for second chances. And if we suppose that, then we have to make sure that we actually set it up so they can. So echoing all of that and just adding in some more too.
Well,
sorry.
Alana, I'll let you weave in your answer too. But also, I would love to shift just a little bit, because we're talking about it. We're talking about kind of the this is being occupational licensure, frankly, is very anti-competitive behavior. And, Washington is looking for antitrust issues. Here you go. It's at the state level in particular. I know I would love, since you talk to so many lawmakers, for you to talk about the Oppo. So give us some Oppo research. What the opposition to these licensure reforms, why are they doing it? And what are some of the strategies that they are employing that maybe folks should be keeping an eye out for?
Okay, that's a great question. I have a couple things to say here.
Yeah, go for it.
First, very quickly, I want to just go back to and explain what the good moral character clauses are in different legislative codes for these licensures, so that people can kind of understand how they're determined, and then how that disproportionately affects disadvantaged communities, particularly those of color too. So just very quickly, a good moral character clause, like Shoshana said, is a very vague, and there is no definition of what that actually means. Now, a lot of times these boards are made up of folks who are in the industry, which is great to have industry experts on boards because they know what's necessary, right? However, there goes the competitive aspect of it. So if there is a really good florist, for instance, coming down the pike in Louisiana, because that's where it's, not to pick on Louisiana too much, but that's where they're licensed. I guess we could do horse masseuses in Kentucky. We can do milk haulers in Pennsylvania. We could do all the things. We can do all the things. So when a good moral character clause is set into place and somebody goes to apply for their licensure, and maybe they got an underage or a DUI or just a non-violent drug offense, and it happened 15 years ago, much like the person with IJ, it was a non-violent drug offense. Correct me if I'm wrong, Darwin. And to go and try to better their lives, the folks who also have salons right next to where she would open up her salon, are the people who said no. They're the gatekeepers to your future, your economic future, and you contributing economically to society and having a sense of self-worth after serving your time. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that, so to give people kind of a bigger and better idea and more in-depth idea of how these good moral character clauses are in fact holding back folks who do have criminal records from re-entering the workforce. So there's that there. Now, I will touch and say that it obviously disproportionately affects those of color, and that also goes with representation. So going back to this conference I was at, and again, I'll be looking down again because these are numbers that are important that I do not want to mess up. The National Association Boards of Pharmacy actually did their own survey because they were seeing this gap happening with racial representation on their boards. And they surveyed over 400 members of the Board of State Pharmacy. And their results showed that 78% of board members were white, where only 22% were non-white. And that might sound okay for the state or whatever, but they're to serve the entire US population. And the US population, 57% are white, where 43% are non-white. So when there's 43% of you and you only have a 22% representation, then there's obviously a problem there. So that's just, again, and those are the folks who are determining the issues. And we actually got told a story about 2 back-to-back cases of pharmacy issues that were just little one-offs. They didn't put anyone in danger, but it was a violation of their licensure, something that they did. And it was literally back-to-back cases, like the same day. And one was a pharmacist who was white and one was a pharmacist who was non-white. And the pharmacy board for the white one said, okay, kind of like, you learned your lesson, we'll give you your license back, no big deal. And then the very next case, they were almost exactly the same case. They said, oh no, and they threw the whole book at the non-white pharmacist. And it's all because of representation. It's because of representation. There was no one on that board, because there was no one in color on that board in that situation to advocate for that specific person when they literally did the same thing. And again, it just comes to representation, understanding of different cultures, understanding of the way that things go in different cultures. And you can't replicate that anywhere else other than having a representative there who can speak on your behalf. So with that being said, there is a paper out there by Dr. Peter Blair from Harvard, who did a study back when he was at Clemson University on how occupational licensing does help with wages of those of color and women. However, the problem is getting that license. So that is something that is, an oppositional thing that is like, hey, once we do get this license, our wages are really similar. It's not, the 50 cents to the dollar and keep going down the line depending on which, group that you're in. So there is that there, but it's getting the license initially. It's kind of like, well, I'm glad that there's, equality when it comes to income or comes to wages, or more equality, because it's still not equal, right? It's still not equal. Women are still not being paid the same, and women of color definitely still aren't being paid the same at all. So, it's still not completely equal. It's just a little bit better, but the hurdle to get the license in the first place, it does disproportionately affect women and those of color specifically. So that is one of the things of opposition that I've heard. Then I will just say, and this may be something a little too flippant, but it is the story I hear the most in most legislature, is there was one person that something happened to, and now we have to license everyone. That's you. Shoshana, you'll know too, because you talk to legislators. It's always like one person who was in their district, and these people are necessary. These people matter, absolutely 100%. However, instead of looking at the huge scope of the situation that happened, we're like, it's because they weren't licensed. When that 9 times out of 10, or I would even say argue 10 out of 10, but I'm going to leave a little bit of marginal room for error. It's not the case. There was negligence on someone's part that wouldn't have been stopped with a license. So I think that those are like the 2 biggest pushbacks that I generally hear across the country when I go to different legislators. And I know the 2 of you also speak with different legislators, Shoshana, you especially down in DC. So if you want to chime in on that, then yeah. So, but I wanted to add that extra good moral character factor, just so people understand, why it's people are saying no. And then there's only some states, very quickly going on that have to actually give you written proof as to why they denied you your license. So not even all 50 states have to even give you proof. They can just say no, and that's the end of it. So there's a lot of issues there too, but that's what I got so far.
Yeah, Shoshana and Darwin, quickly before we wrap, I'd love for you to give your closing or respond to Alana's thoughts there.
Yeah, I think one example that kind of encapsulates how all of this works for the opposition, and some of it's earnest, some of it's genuinely earnest, but a lot of it is not. It's kind of like a combination of that one thing happened to one guy / moral panic, and then I'm trying to think how to put it, and then politicians worried, and then sometimes regulatory capture. And this one example a couple of years ago really hit the spot. So PetSmart killed a bunch of dogs. Like, I think a lot of it, I'm not sure if anyone else has dogs. I'm dog sitting right now. He's not bothering me. I haven't killed him. I'm really proud of that. But most people who have dogs don't kill their dogs. Most people groom their dogs and don't kill their dogs. But PetSmart employees in New Jersey were killing dogs. And it was horrible. There was a real investigation into it. So PetSmart was like, I guess you should license us. So who can afford to license their employees? Do you think it's the your friend who like grooms dogs for fun around the neighborhood, maybe trying to make some extra money during high school? Or do you think it's PetSmart? PetSmart can afford the licenses, so they proposed to be able to license dog groomers so you wouldn't kill dogs. And I'm like, it wasn't the kid, it wasn't like some weird kid killing dogs. It wasn't the shop around the corner. It was PetSmart. They had evidence. Literally, I at the time I wrote it in 2018, it was still happening, and PetSmart knew and they weren't doing anything. But politicians were like, "Oh no, well this bad thing is happening." They didn't take into account that it was only under PetSmart's watch. It wasn't like there's certain animals that you do have to have like really careful care for, especially wild animals. I'm a sloth enthusiast. They're very delicate creatures. I understand licensing there. That's another conversation. But it was that combination that led them to be like, oh, maybe we should license dog groomers. And I see that a lot. Oh, this one bad thing happened. And it's like, okay, but does the license solve it? For example, and this gets into the other barriers, like people talk a lot about home contractors running out of town and not finishing jobs after they get the money. We're not even doing the jobs. We're doing a bad job. Mandatory registration will solve that, making sure you verify the information so that if that happens to someone, then they have recourse and then they can sue them and go after them. But a license isn't, for that particular issue, isn't going to solve it. For massage therapists and salons, they worry about human trafficking. I'm not saying it's not a concern, but you don't need to go to school to learn how to massage someone correctly in order to not human traffic. If you're going to human traffic, you're going to human traffic, and that should be stopped. But you don't need the licensing as part of that. That can be inspections and mandatory registration. Even with salons, they have high rates of infection. So like, okay, instead of licensing, maybe it's more health inspections like we do with food, really making sure there's that means and it's fit. But when you get into there ought to be a law, like that guy from all the movies is like a real person and he's in Congress and he's in the state houses. And sometimes he's a woman, sometimes he's like whatever, but like he's all different people. That guy exists, and it's something we have to resist and really think through. What's the problem? Can this be fixed by licensing? Or sometimes bad things will happen, but licensing won't fix it. And then you just price poor people out of jobs. So all that needs to be taken into account. So I love getting to do this work, and there's a lot of different facets, but sometimes it's just, the way to get into thinking about it is thinking through what would have stopped this? What could you have put in the way that would have stopped the issue and not stopped lots of other people who were doing things right from happening? So I don't mind not having like doctors in places that we don't know about without licenses. Like that's not something I'm worried about stopping. But hair braiders, yeah, if you want to braid hair, like braid hair. So thinking through that. But yeah, I love doing this work. I've been into this for almost 10 years. Giant nerd, and grateful you had me to talk about it.
Awesome.
And I just like to echo something Shoshana and Alana have touched on here, is how this impacts people on the other side of the market. We've talked a lot about the labor market opportunities for people and for women in particular and how they're impacted by licensing. But a lot of these services are for services that women use, right? So childcare licensing is extensive. There's a wonderful article in the Journal of Law and Economics that looks at childcare licensing. There's another one that you can see, like, does it actually affect quality? It does actually improve quality, but it also reduces access to childcare for low-income neighborhoods. So suddenly women can't get childcare, and that impacts their ability to go do work. Why do people want to be licensed? Well, what we know from the literature is that when you're licensed, you actually earn more, and it's because you don't face as much competition. So you don't face that market competition. You can charge your consumers more. That sounds great to the people who are licensed, but people who are not licensed and can't get work, and people who then have to pay for the services end up sort of just losing out on this piece. So another great example of this is lactation consultants, right? So in Georgia right now, the Supreme Court in Georgia overturned basically this new license for lactation consultants, women who just need help when they have newborns, right? And these lactation consultants, who are mostly women, come in. I think they're all women. I'm an economist. So I'm like, well, I think in the limit they're all women. But that's thinking about we're basically taking away jobs. Who had a vested interest in making that happen? The vendor that was going to basically benefit from everybody having to go through their training process, pay them fees and tuition, so that they could then have a smaller market, and then women couldn't get lactation consultants as much. So childcare is a big one, lactation consultants. We can think about teachers again, and a lot of like beauty services, right? So this also is an area for entrepreneurship for women. And so we can think about cosmetology, of course, which is licensed in all 50 states and DC, same with barbers. But there's also things like eyebrow threaders, skincare specialists, and of course, African hair braiders who were so heavily regulated under cosmetology boards. A majority of states no longer actually require them to be licensed. 15 states now do separately require them to be licensed. This really does affect entrepreneurship for women. So we can think about both prices for consumers and opportunities for women in the workforce.
That's a great way of rounding out our conversation. You guys are fantastic. And I think we hit so many different angles. And I love that we brought it both to the consumer aspect, but we really focused on the worker and employment aspect, but it all works together. And so, I really appreciate you guys taking some time this afternoon to walk us through a lot of these exciting reforms that's happening in licensing, and the fact that, it's not one size fits all, that there are so many different ways that you can ensure quality, ensure good service, ensure competence without going to that, according to the inverted pyramid. Okay, I'm there. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think I got that right. But you can ensure all of those things without going to the ends of licensing, which again locks people out of opportunity. And I think that's the biggest one. So Alana, Shoshana, and Darwin, thank you so much for joining us today. And I would love to have you back sometime again in the future to talk more about this. Ladies, thank you. And thank you to our audience today. We hope today's chat was informative and helpful and lively. I would love for you to continue the conversation with myself and some of my colleagues at a unique place, which is the Independent Women's Network. This is our members only community, Independent Women's Network. There, you've got the link right there. You're going to have access to conversations, regular programming, live programming like this with influencers, with policymakers, with big names, resources, to give you kind of the tips to how to bust some of those myths that you hear so much about. This place is for the happening ladies and men, actually. But the happening people who are tired of the talking points and really feel like they want to be part of a community where they will not be canceled for their views. So head up to iwnetwork.com. You can activate a free pass, free pass, or you can select a level of membership that is right for you. If you want more, we're happy to offer you more. And finally, please sign up for our newsletter at iwf.org/CEO to stay on top of all of these labor, tech and labor and economic issues broadly. Again, I'm Patrice. It's been great to hang out with you guys for the past about hour, and we will be back next month with more programming, things that you're interested in, but let's continue the conversation. I will meet you over at IW and Independent Women's Network. All right. Until next time, I hope that you will be well, that you will strive, and that you will thrive. Thank you so much.